In the Soviet Union, everyone lived under the watchful eye of the state eye. Neighbors, colleagues, and sometimes even relatives could write a denunciation at any time, wrapping a person's life in fear and uncertainty. The system of denunciations in the USSR became a real control machine, making people afraid of each other and silent about their thoughts. Thousands of anonymous notes accusing people of hostile intentions were received daily by the organs, and many of them were written simply out of envy or resentment. But how did this system begin? Why did denunciations become part of everyday life? And what fates awaited those who fell under suspicion? Under Stalin, a person could go to prison just because a neighbor decided to write a denunciation against him, and this was quite normal in the Soviet Union. The practice of denunciation began back in the 1930s, and every year its scale only grew. The system of denunciation itself, as a means of control and intimidation, became an everyday reality for millions of people. In those years, every third Soviet citizen lived in constant fear of being watched. It was easy to write a denunciation. You had to send a short note of suspicion. This document could contain anything. Sometimes not even facts were required. Fictitious accusations or petty complaints were enough. Most denunciations were anonymous, and the denouncer did not have to openly state his or her details. Thus, in a day, there were up to 1,000 denunciations from all over the country. Imagine a flood of papers where the fate of each person was decided in one line. Stalin and his entourage realized that with the help of denunciations, easier to manage society. The word enemy of the people appeared. Now anyone who allegedly undermined the foundations of Soviet power became an enemy. But in practice, these enemies often turned out to be ordinary people who had done nothing illegal. For example, one denunciation could sound like this: "My neighbor spoke badly about the authorities last night." This was enough for interrogations and detentions to begin. The denunciations were most often not against enemies of the state or spies, but against people with whom there were ordinary, everyday conflicts. This was especially noticeable in communal apartments. Here, in cramped quarters and with constant quarrels, denunciations became a way to take revenge or get more space. Ordinary envy and domestic quarrels, in the conditions of strict regime, turned into a lethal weapon against neighbors. There was another reason for mass denunciations: fear. Many people were forced to write denunciations about acquaintances or colleagues. Otherwise, they could fall under suspicion themselves. People wrote out of fear that if they did not rat out someone in their neighborhood, they would be accused of having ties with the enemy. But what is most striking is the fact that everyone who was a little better than others was denounced. If a person had a bigger apartment, a higher position, and children studying at a good school, envy began to take over. In this way, an enemy image was created of an ordinary person who was accused of having ties with Western countries or of subversion. Denunciations as a habit and way of life formed a special society. People became afraid to openly express their opinions and communicate with their neighbors. They were afraid to bring up difficult topics and often even to talk in the kitchen. At any moment, someone could be listening behind the wall. Such a system broke thousands of destinies, destroyed trust between people. After all, a person might not know who wrote a denunciation against him, but suddenly disappeared at one moment, and his neighbors were afraid to even remember his name. Why would a person write a denunciation against a friend or neighbor, knowing that doing so would send him or her to prison or even death? It is difficult to answer this question, but there are several reasons that made ordinary people become part of this terrible system. In the Soviet Union, people denounced others not only out of personal animosity. They were often driven by fear or even the desire to protect themselves. At that time, the authorities implanted in people's heads the idea that there were plenty of enemies of the people around. Anyone who was insufficiently loyal or criticized could be under suspicion. Everyone knew that if one of his acquaintances came to the attention of the security services, it would affect him as well. Therefore, many people preferred to write a denunciation first in order not to find themselves in the suspect's shoes. Thus, one by one, people wrote denunciations, obeying the fear of the system. But there was even more terrible coercion when children were forced to denounce. There were cases when teenagers were forced to denounce their parents, threatening them with expulsion from school or the komsomol. Imagine how these children, not yet realizing the cruelty of the system, were caught between their sense of duty and their love for their family. Often behind the denunciations there was also a desire for profit. In conditions of housing shortages and low wages, denunciation could be a way to solve one's problems. If someone was jealous of a neighbor because of a room in a communal apartment or success at work, denunciation was a quick solution to get rid of a competitor. Such situations led to the separation of people. Eventually, trust disappeared, and people became afraid to talk openly, even in the kitchen. Everyone could become an informer, and everyone was afraid of being victimized. The army of informers included people of many different professions and ages. Why were ordinary people, seemingly without evil intentions, so easily drawn into the system of denunciation? Often the informers lived in the same communal apartments or worked side by side with their victims. Among them were not only outsiders but also close relatives, colleagues, and neighbors. In communal flats, denunciations were often written against neighbors, especially if there was an opportunity to win from their arrest. For example, to get their room or simply to get rid of inconvenient neighbors. In some cases, even relatives denounced their relatives, hoping to get their apartment or a place at work as a result. People wrote on those with whom they shared a kitchen and a bathroom, and sometimes these were the closest ones, those who knew all the weaknesses and details of life. There were also many informers among teachers and educators. They not only denounced their colleagues but also ratted out students and their parents. Sometimes it was done in order to avoid suspicion themselves, and sometimes just for ostentatious loyalty to the authorities. In addition, denunciations were often made by those who were looking for an easy way to get promoted. They saw denunciations as an opportunity to prove themselves to their superiors. A denunciation of a superior or a colleague could ensure a fast career. A person would get a new position or a bonus, and often it was the person who had just written a denunciation. But there were also those who denounced simply out of envy. Whistleblowers were annoyed by the success of others, better pay, or simply popularity. A neighbor who bought a new suit or a colleague who went on a trip at the expense of the company could become victims of such denunciation. At first glance, denunciations may appear to be simply a means of personal gain, but in fact they undermined trust between people, destroying families, friendships, and teams. The Soviet system, by encouraging denunciations, built a society where it was easier to turn someone in than to trust them. So why did such a destructive practice exist for so long? And how did it affect society itself? Imagine falling asleep in silence and suddenly there is a loud knock on the door in the middle of the night. Suddenly your neighbor, colleague, or even a relative is arrested. Often it happened precisely at night, so that no one could intercede or even understand where and why the person was being taken. This was created on purpose so that there would be more fear and mystery surrounding the disappearance. For ordinary people, the denunciation system became a real nightmare because everyone knew that one denunciation and a person could simply disappear. In homes, people were even afraid to talk about politics or power because you never knew if someone would hear the words and decide to turn them in. After arrest, many people disappeared without a trace. People arrested on the basis of denunciations were often forbidden to write or receive letters. Families were left in the dark. Their loved one disappeared, and they did not even know where he was or if he was alive at all. In communal apartments, people tried not to look at their neighbors. They were afraid to signal that they cared about the fate of the arrested because sympathy could arouse suspicion. Even between husband and wife, there was a tacit agreement not to discuss the detentions that were taking place literally in neighboring rooms. People became accustomed to the fact that one could not speak, could not discuss, and could not even think out loud. Domestic denunciations destroyed not only the fates of individuals, but also relations between friends and families. The very system of denunciations formed a strange atmosphere. People learned to live as if no one could be trusted. Even with their children, parents did not discuss what was going on around them. This created a whole generation of people who knew that personal thoughts should be kept to themselves. In a society where anyone could become a snitch, fear became part of everyday life. Interestingly, many of those who wrote denunciations ended up becoming victims of this terrible system themselves. It would seem that the informers were loyal to the authorities and did everything to please them, but the system acted ruthlessly and unpredictably. Once someone denounced them, they found themselves in the same position as their victims. The fear they had once used was now turning against them. One could see whistleblowers becoming victims at almost every turn. For example, an engineer in Moscow denounced his colleagues in order to get a promotion. A year after their arrest, someone wrote a denunciation against him, and the engineer also disappeared. The system worked like a vicious circle in which no one was really safe. If someone wrote a denunciation, it did not mean that he would avoid arrest in the future. As the saying goes, fear is great. Anyone could be under suspicion. After Stalin's death, when the system of denunciation was officially condemned, its victims still did not receive any vindication. People who had served time for denunciations were not reinstated, and the denouncers were never brought to justice. It was as if the country simply turned a blind eye to the pain that millions had endured. Some informers later tried to justify themselves by saying that they had written denunciations out of fear or for the sake of security. But the excuses were of little interest to anyone. People remembered who had destroyed their families and who had caused their suffering. After the denunciation system was abolished, former denunciators tried to hide their involvement and avoided talking about the past because they knew they would not be forgiven. In the end, the whistleblowers themselves were part of the system that used and discarded them. They hoped to protect themselves, but ended up victimizing themselves. This dark period reminds us how important it is to value trust and humanity, because fear and mistrust can destroy an entire society.